Marvel Snap's We Are Venom season just started. Let's take a look at the best place to allocate your spotlight caches this month. By the time you're watching this video, this cache will be out and functioning. It starts with the card Scream. Scream is a 2/2 with an effective +4 scaling whenever your opponent moves a card or one of your opponent's cards is moved. This means it is an effective tech card potentially against the Madam Web decks, but also a powerful card in conjunction with cards like Polaris and Stegron and Arrow, potentially. When I look at Scream, what I see is ultimately a card that will be able to shine as a sub-package in a Clog deck. That's what I expect from it. When you look at the Thena Clog deck that I've been playing, that's been on some of my last few tier lists, I think that Scream, Polaris, Stegron is like a fairly reasonable substitute stats package there, because not only is Scream scaling in a way that helps you with Thena, that helps you be sort of analogous to Thena in the power department, you also have this ability of Polaris and Stegron to like focus your Clog onto one lane. Something like Polaris Titania is the similar outcome to a Green Goblin Titania play on turn 4. You're getting something to move into that lane, being able to curve, say, Scream, Debris, Polaris, Titania. That seems like a really good way to clog people up, and it has the upside of Polaris being a 3/5, so you're really able to get a lot of value out of that package. As far as developing into a deck on its own, I'm not sure it's going to be able to do that because of the necessity for you to have Clog in a deck like this if you want to keep your opponents on your level. There are a lot of powerful strategies in Marvel Snap right now that are very easily able to outpower you if you're not dragging them down to where you are. That means Hela, Bounce, any number of Agent Venom decks, probably. All of them are going to have more points output than pretty much any Scream deck you actually put together. Because fundamentally, a Scream deck is going to want to be playing Polaris and Stegron instead of, you're playing a Stegron, they're playing like, God only knows what they're doing, like they're bouncing a Sage or whatever. They're just going to be taller than you if you're going to try to go against them straight up. So you need a way to keep them on your level because these decks are so good at losing priority, whether that be both Hela or Bounce or any number of Agent Venom decks, presumably. You are going to also want to be able to minimize their total access to the board. That's why I see Scream as sort of a clog card, and that's actually how I feel about most scalers right now. These sort of scaling Thena type cards are good, but they need a coherent game plan to drag things like Hela and Bounce down to their level and then beat them with experience. That's what I envision for Scream. I think that she's actually very likely going to be a good card in Clog Shells that are hybridizing with this small move package. I think that's going to be quite solid, and it's definitely a place that I'm going to be playing on day one. I wouldn't be surprised if the video I release right after this is focused on a deck like that. I really do expect it to be a very solid card. It just suffers from the same thing that Thena suffers from, which is right now, things go very tall. In other metagames, I can see Scream being even better. I think this is a card that I genuinely like. I am higher on this than many of my other high elo compatriots who are, relatively high on this, but probably not as high as I am. I'm excited to see what it can do, and I like that Scream is able to give you access to an archetype that wasn't necessarily played before. Getting people to play Polaris and Stegron and actually having that be good would be an amazing design choice. Alongside Scream in the caches is Mobius M. Mobius. He is a card that you are almost never going to be sad to have in your collection, but may not always make it out of your collection and into your decks. He is obviously best used with the card Pixie, to the point that both Pixie and Mobius, to me, sort of key off of how relevant Mobius is rather than how relevant Pixie is. Now, this is a sort of fusion of two cards, so we do have to talk about them both in the same context. If you do not have Pixie, it's likely not worth picking up Mobius, but also he's very rarely going to be somebody you're upset to own. He's just sort of extremely metagame dependent because he's a very really specific tech card. Outside of his role as a tech card, it's almost entirely with Pixie, so we do have to talk about it in that context. Pixie and Mobius is a combination of cards that I tend to use more often when Mobius is good into the metagame. When I want to be able to effectively free roll a Mobius, I have a Pixie Mobius deck ready to use Mobius both offensively to allow me to put more points on the board with my Pixie, and defensively to prevent my opponent from cheating energy. If cheating energy becomes a major part of the metagame, which I'm not saying it will, but there are some Agent Venom decks floating around that look fairly energy cheat oriented, and maybe on day one this card will be relevant. I do think that generally this has not been the metagame for Pixie Mobius because all of the ways in which people cheat have been different. There has been less energy cheating and more outright cheating. Like, yeah, Bounce has Beast in it, but that's not really why it's gonna beat you. Something like Hela doesn't cheat energy at all. It doesn't really matter. And it's very hard for a deck that is just playing stats, as many Pixie Mobius decks tend to do, to actually keep up with the stats output from a Hela or a Bounce deck, even if that Bounce deck doesn't necessarily have access to the discount on Beast. The stat output does end up being very difficult for you to beat. The issue that Pixie Mobius decks tend to have is that they tend to be these sort of very plotting, telegraphed mid-range decks, and the way they sort of invert that and add something to it is with Pixie with Mobius. So you go from this plotting, telegraphed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mid-range deck to a deck that can explode, play multiple 6-drops on the final turn of the game, have like 1 energy Claws, 1 energy Red Hulks. Stuff like that is really good in a metagame where those are relevant bodies, but not as good in a metagame where Hela has the ability to drop a bunch of points on you in a more effective way. This also comes with some relative weaknesses to clog decks because you are pretty much playing 1 card per turn. Anytime you put 2 cards in a lane, boom, 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 you kind of get run over. You end up in that awkward situation that no one wants to be in, which is there is a Titania in your lane and there's an empty space on your opponent's board and your lane is full and they're gonna win that one and then they cannonball you and then you're sad. So on the whole, Pixie Mobius decks have been on sort of a downswing in terms of relevance in the metagame, but that's far from saying that they're unplayable. These are perfectly playable, perfectly functional decks that, even though they're on a relative downswing, are always worth respecting, and you can always lose to that nut draw. There are some things going against them, but I don't think that means that you should be averse to acquiring Mobius M. Mobius. Next up is Man-Thing, who since his buff to 4/7 has been a very relevant part of the metagame in, granted, some very hyper-specific decks. Man-Thing pretty much goes in Afflict decks. And there are really 2 major versions of the Afflict deck as we talk about it right now. There is the High Evolutionary Abomination version of the deck, and there is the Wiccan version of the deck. Both of them, if you want to play them, you will need Man-Thing to do. Man-Thing is a key part of why these decks make sense in the current metagame. The multiple afflictions that this card can cause make High Evo Abomination much cheaper. It makes it a 4-drop that can nearly win a lane on its own, one of the best kiln cards in existence, just a very generally strong and powerful card in the context that exists for it, but you do have to be deck building within that context. You want to play this card alongside things that work with it, whether that be High Evo Abomination so that you are able to benefit from those negative pips that you're applying to your opponent, or Luke Cage so that your cards don't get applied to it. Either way, this is not a deck that is a sort of sub-package kind of thing. There are not a lot of splash versions of Man-Thing decks, and there can be, but there's not a ton of them. In my view, this is a card that wants to go with US Agent, it wants to go with Ajax, it wants to go with multiple other cards that you might not have. And I think that would be the one thing I would warn you against if you were someone who was thinking of purchasing this cash form Man-Thing, is that he's very good, but he also has several partners in crime that you really want to be able to access in order to effectively run him. He's part of a package with several Series 4 and 5 cards, and that can make him a little bit inaccessible. It's not that you're going to be sad to have him, it's that you're not going to be able to use him to his full extent until you have these other cards as well. And that is something that I think is something to warn people about when we talk about what is otherwise just a very strong card. Next up is Misery, a 4/7 with an On Reveal ability that repeats the abilities of the other On Reveal cards here and destroys them. This is a card that fundamentally I don't particularly grasp. I see it and I'm like, okay, I can think of things to do with this, but none of them seem all that much better than the things we can already do, except one. This card strikes me as a very powerful card in Clog Mirrors. It blows up your opponent's goblins. It repeats the abilities of your debris. It repeats the abilities of your White Widow. There are some interesting things going on here, right? Like it blows up some stuff and it repeats the abilities of some other stuff, and it's a 4/7. I can see that happening. I can see that being a thing I care about. I can see that being relevant. I can see it mattering. We've had metagames before. Granted, they were a little bit different in context. It was more like people playing Lady Deathstrike to beat like Annihilus type stuff. But we've had metagames where cards like this have been relevant as a countermeasure / offensive option. Now, will that happen here? I don't really know. Whenever people talk about like the nut draws with this card, it's all like stuff that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I don't want to play this in my Surfer deck, even though I would love to get duplicates of like abilities like Silver Surfer, because then I'm blowing up my own Brood, right? Like I'm blowing up my Killmonger. I'm blowing up, like there's multiple cards in that deck that have on reveal abilities that I don't want to blow up. I guess I keep looking at this and I'm like, I can see where there are places where it makes sense. I can see how in a world where Clog is very good, this can be a piece of relevant tech that I think might actually be very helpful. I totally see that. And I also see how costing 4 is significantly better than Lady Deathstrike's 5. All of that makes sense. I get it. I just, whenever I think about what this card is supposed to do on its own, what does a Misery deck look like? That's where I keep drawing blanks. That's where you can imagine just several question marks over my head. Like I just saw someone, like I just saw Solid Snake in a box, but I'm not really actually sure that I saw Solid Snake in a box, so I have to go over there and check. That's where I'm at right now with this card. I don't really get it. And so for that reason, I think that, like, personally, when I look at this, when I say I don't really get it, what I mean is I think it's going to not find a home. And I want to be wrong about that because it's an exciting and unique and interesting card. But the best I can see this card doing is anti-Clog Club, right? Like, I don't see it forming its own archetype or boosting a previous archetype the way something like Misery or the way something like Scream does for Polaris and Stegron, things like that. I don't see it for this, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. This is a unique and fun and intriguing game piece, and it has a 4/7 stat line, and I keep looking, it's like it feels like this card, it's very hard for it to be bad, but it's also very hard for it to be good. And that's what I keep coming back to, is like, what if the 4/7 just makes it playable and it's just like totally fine and you're happy with a 4/7, right? That also makes sense to me. You can just dump this in an empty lane for nothing and just have a 4/7. Like, that's probably fine. I just don't know if that's the metagame we're in. And in the metagame we're in, the best utility I can see for it is Anti-Clog Club. If that's something you're into and that ends up working out, this might actually be worth picking up. At the time of recording, which is about as the new season comes out, War Machine is one of the strongest cards in the game, in my opinion. The War Machine combo decks are very, very powerful. Storm War Machine Legion, strong, but War Machine enabling things like Ebony Maw and the Infinite to be played, also very strong. The main thing that this card does very well is allow you to have storms that you can win later, and then let you play the Infinite. You get to do things like win a storm lane very, very hard by having an extra turn to play on it, that being turn 5, and then literally just drop 20 power in one of the other lanes. That's the baseline War Machine playline. That's not even talking about the Storm War Machine Legion lines that lock your opponent out of the game entirely on turn 5 and are an incredibly potent line against a deck like Hela. This is a strong card. There's really no two ways around it. They have allowed this card to exist with a slight nerf to its power, and I personally think that that still has not changed. Storm War Machine decks I expect to be a major part of the metagame when this card comes out. I can't think of a lot of reasons why they wouldn't be. It's strong. This card is good as hell. Now, one note is that every Storm War Machine deck I have played has used Madam Web in it. And if a lot of people are playing Scream, I think it might be perhaps the wrong time to be a Madam Web deck. And that is actually a big hit to this archetype because it uses Madam Web very well. Whether or not it's hybridizing with move cards, it's still very interested in being able to position the way that it wants to position without having any restrictions on that. With Scream coming out, it could be a meaningful restriction. There could be some really awkward things happening, ways in which your opponent can impact that Storm lane without actually impacting it. I'm not sure yet, but I can tell you that right now, at the time of recording, this is a very powerful card in the game, Marvel Snap. As long as you have access to the card Legion, a lot of the other cards that go with it are actually series 1 through 3. It's actually like kind of a budget deck. Not a pure budget deck, but there's like kind of a lot you can get done with stuff like Jubilee, with stuff like Ebony Maw and the Infinite. Like, there are some interesting things. And especially if Scream forces Madam Web out of a lot of these lists, we might be looking at a very budgeted deck. Namora is not a weak card, but she is a bit of a metagame casualty. The decks she is meant to be in are stats mid-range type decks, where you play a card on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like you do things like this, you set up your Namora, and all your cards are like well above curve, so you're playing a lot of stats, but they're still fundamentally like the kind of thing that in development is like regarded as quote-unquote fair. There's counterplays to things like this into Miss Marvel, and so you end up in a situation... Man, everyone's been pointing out how much I say end up in a situation. I was really trying not to this episode. I guess I ended up in a situation. Anyway, you end up in a situation where Namora is a good card that does some powerful things, but has weaknesses not just to the clog decks that go under her and prevent her from being impactful, but also to the Hela decks that can go over her, to the bounce decks that can go over her, potentially to any Agent Venom decks that will have the ability to go over her, because that seems to be the direction those decks are trending. Like, this is a card that is in a role that is not valued in the current metagame. And that's not to say she's bad. Like, part of the reason I do these videos is so I give you an explanation of, is the card good right now? Why is the card good right now or not good right now? And what situations is this card good in? And Namora is good when there isn't a lot of clog. Like these Wong Namora decks, those decks have always been good when we are in relative mid-range metagames, and they can play a relative mid-range game with the Wong Namora White Tiger stuff as their plan to go over the top of other mid-range decks. That's when they're good. When Hela is around, when Bounce is around in the numbers that it's in right now, it's not as good because they can actually just beat that number of points. Now, you will be able to beat Bounce, I think, a lot of the time. You can beat Hela if you have the nut. Like, this is the kind of thing that it can compete if you actually have unit, Wong, Namora, Odin. Big numbers. Big numbers. You're looking at some real big-ass numbers that are probably going to beat a Hela deck there. You need exactly that. And because of the way the decks are built, they're built in such a way that they're like half mid-range, and then you have the combo. And in this metagame, you almost always just want the combo. And that's a really awkward situation to put yourself in. And I think that's when we talk about like why Namora hasn't been showing up as much recently. That's the main reason. Next up is Scorn, a 1/2 with the ability that says when you discard this, give it and a card on your board +2 power and return it to your hand. This is Small Apocalypse. It's giving you that +4 power, but some of it's going to be on the board, and it only costs 1. This is a great card to start discarding early, a great card to start discarding late. You are very interested in this if you play any type of MODOK discard. MODOK discard is perhaps my least favorite of the traditional early game archetypes. Move, zoo, destroy, discard. Wow, smashed the mic there. Because MODOK discard tends to be the least interactive of them, and the one that wants to be interacted with the least. It is a deck that wants to play Dracula, it wants to play Morbius, it wants to sit back, and then it wants to say, actually, you can't target me until such time as I am able to prevent or provide an extremely large number of points to this board in support of my position. It is a pure points deck, and this is a pure points card. I cannot imagine that this ends up actually worse, but I can imagine that it's a little bit hard to find the right balance of discard payoffs and discard enablers with a deck like this. Now, with this card in the deck, we have not only Swarm and Apocalypse, but Proxima Midnight. And what does our deck look like when we have Swarm, Apocalypse, Scorn, Proxima Midnight? We have 4 of them now. Is that the right number? Do we have to like start thinking about cutting Swarm? Do we have to start thinking about cutting Proxima Midnight? I am interested to see what ends up happening with the construction of these decks. But on baseline, having a card that you discard the entire game, and then instead, like, you have your Dracula, you have your Apocalypse or whatever in hand, you got that going on for you. And then you can also just play this on the final turn of the game. One of the things that very often happens in discard decks is they get down to turn 6, their hand is all Apocalypses and Swarms. It's just one big Apocalypse and then Swarm. There's a Dracula on the board, and they're like, well, I guess I just have to play all the Swarms, and their opponent can just math out, hey, what happens if they play all the Swarms here, and then try to play to beat that, right? This card gives you something else to play alongside those Swarms, and hopefully it's something that is actually pretty damn big. This card can be like 6 or 8 power and really mess up that math on the final turn of the game for your opponent, because one of the big weaknesses of discard is that math. Like, your opponent is able to be like, all right, look, even if they play all the Swarms, I can win by beating all the Swarms, right? If they play all the Swarms and then don't play the Apocalypse, that goes on the Dracula. I can calculate for that. So your only real mix-up is playing out the Apocalypse in a lane that they're not expecting, forcing them into like sort of 50-50 scenarios. Now you have an additional element on those turns. And I think that additional element is actually like kind of crucial for a deck like Discard, whose main weakness is how telegraphed it is. This card could be legitimately important for making those endgame boards a lot less predictable from a discard deck. Jean Grey is a, I would say, below par card, and not in the way that you want to be below par when we talk about golf. Like, this is a card that does not have a ton of use. I know there are going to be several people who get a little bit annoyed at me for saying that, like, oh, I play Jean Grey Cosmo to beat Hela. Like, that has not proven to be a great countermeasure over large sample sizes. It's definitely the kind of thing that can win you one game, but it wins you one game in pretty unfortunate fashion a lot of the time, and the rest of the time your deck does not match up to the power level of the rest of the things in the metagame right now. She's not a bad card, but she is a card that has almost never been part of the best deck in the game. I can't think of a single time she's been part of the best deck in the game. I can't think of a time she's been part of any of the 5 best decks in the game. She is a sort of rogue deck builders card, where if you're the kind of person who likes finding value in things other people think suck, she's a great card for you. And I do think that, like, she is a good enough card at that you will be able to win games with her. You will be able to build around her. Typically, people play her as a control tool in ongoing decks. Those decks are fairly mediocre at handling things, but we do like that they have the ability to Cosmo stuff, because there are a lot of powerful on-reveals in the game right now. Ongoing decks have been this sort of Jean Grey control lockdown type thing for a little bit. I don't particularly consider it a very good archetype. It's not great. If you are a new player and you want a deck that can get your foot in the door, this is not the worst card in the world to pick up, because she is one of the only actual expensive cards that gets run in those decks. You will be able to play the deck completely if you have her, I believe. Potentially you may need like US Agent Luke Cage type stuff, but that's the other thing, right? Like, to my mind, the best build of these Jean Grey Spectrum decks is US Agent Luke Cage Man-Thing. And we just talked about this with Man-Thing, where it's like, I don't even think this is the best work. Like, if you wanted to play US Agent Luke Cage Man-Thing, there are better decks to do that in. And so these Spectrum decks end up being like the 3rd best version of that. And it's like, why are we even bothering, right? I think that this card is ultimately not worth opening caches for. Sebastian Shaw is similarly pigeonholed by archetype, but he is pigeonholed into an archetype that has traditionally been a little bit better, even though this metagame isn't great for it for a variety of reasons. Silver Surfer is a genuinely strong deck, has basically always been a genuinely strong deck. Sebastian Shaw has basically always been an important part of it being a genuinely strong deck. The addition of Gwenpool has made him matter even more when it comes to that deck making sense. As far as why Silver Surfer has not been a major part of the metagame recently, this is down to the Clog Hela dynamic. You're a Brood Absorbing Man deck, you're not very good against Clog. You are not a deck that goes very tall, so you're not very good against Hela. It's a little bit awkward, and you can go out of your way to try to make those matchups better, but it's not like necessarily worth doing so much as it would be better to play a different deck. Sebastian Shaw's a good card. This is not his time. Next up is Toxin, who strikes me as a potential design mistake. Toxin seems like a very strong card to me, a meaningful buff to bounce decks that already wanted to do what this card wants to do. However, there are going to be, I think this card is going to get overrated and still going to be very good, if that makes sense. A lot of people are going to look at this and be like, oh, this is better than 2-cost beasts. This is so dope. This is the coolest thing ever. I think he's going to be very good, but I don't think he's going to be like, oh my god, we have to nerf this. I think, if anything, Bounce already kind of deserves a nerf, and Toxin might just push that into the spotlight. Toxin just seems like a strong card. This is a card that does the things that you want to do already, and with the buff to Black Swan, the fact that it's not discounting your cards the way Beast does is actually kind of uniquely mitigated in a way by some bounce decks at this point. I expect this card to be just good. I expect it to be in a lot of different bounce decks. I expect it to be a staple card in those decks. And frankly, I expect those decks to be among the best in the game, as they often have been. It's very rare for bounce to go a full month, a full season, however you want to describe it, without being actually good because of the rate at which this game changes. This game has nerfs and meaningful changes to it very, very often. And one thing I've noticed recently is that they are better at addressing situations that arise that are unpleasant. Remember how long we had to live with Thanos? Remember how long we had to live with Professor X? I think the only thing that could be described as annoying on that level is Hela, but it's definitely just like worse than those decks. So it's not, we haven't had a deck that's like that, right? They addressed Arishem immediately, and then they were like, let's address Arishem immediately again. I think they're kind of on it in terms of making sure things don't go overboard right now. They're not necessarily on it in terms of making sure it's fun to play, but they're on it in terms of probably the numbers, right? And so this is a card that I think it's just very hard for me to imagine it not being good. This card just seems like it just is going to be good. If it does have one weakness, it's that it is almost all green power in a metagame where I would expect Shadow King to be fairly relevant, and having all green power, especially green power on the board, can complicate things if you're trying to play around Shadow King. If it has one weakness, I would expect it to be that. How the Mighty Have Fallen. Zabu is not a very metagame relevant card at the current moment. This 2-3 stat line, not good enough to do what he wants to do. I have been using him, and I have seen others use him as a sort of accelerate Wiccan tool. These decks with like Quicksilver into Zabu or Psylocke into Wiccan, like, they're cool. I don't think they're like necessarily going to stick around, but they're super cool. If you want to play that TLSG Galactus deck, the deck does use Zabu well in an interesting way, and I do like that. I don't think that this is a card that's currently worth opening caches for, and I don't really think there's much else to say about that. Zabu is not a card that's worth opening caches for. That's kind of just where we're at right now. He used to be the best card in the game, but that is nearly 2 years ago at this point. Speaking of used to be the best card in the game, I know that sometimes, like, people like to spout off the theory that they buff cards that are going to be in caches or bundles upcoming. If they're going to buff any card, I really want them to buff Elsa Bloodstone. I think that at this point, she could just be a 2-3. And, like, remember, she released at, I believe it was 2-2 giving +3. I think she could be a 2-3 giving +2 in today's current metagame, because when you look at all of the decks that are bounce decks right now, they don't even play her, which sucks. It's sad. There are decks that fill up the board that don't want to play her. She just isn't providing the value that you would need out of a card like this. And I personally think that a lot of that is because she costs 3 instead of costing 2. I would be happy with bringing her to like 2-2 +2. I think that like that would be like a cool thing to do. If they're going to do any buffs for cards in the spotlight caches, please do this one. Like, please make my girl good again. She used to be like, we talk about Zabu being the best card in the game. We talk about Silver Surfer when he gave +3 being the best card in the game. This card was so good, she made Loki mirrors about her. The whole point of being Loki in the Loki mirror was that you were the Elsa deck that had a chance to get your opponent's Elsa. That's what it was about. And that is just like, remember that? Remember when this card was amazing? I don't even think she has to be amazing again, but I'd like her to be playable. Right now, I just don't think she's worth opening for. She's not the kind of card that a lot of things go with. The things that do go with her, Kitty Pryde stuff, have been a little bit less relevant in recent days, and have been a little bit less Elsa-centric in recent months. not a lot of homes for Elsa Bloodstone. Finally, Anti-Venom, a 4/6 with the ability to set the power and cost of the top card of your deck to 0. When I look at this card, the first thing my brain does is say, oh, that's like worse Iron Lad, and then my brain starts working on how do we make it better Iron Lad. And I think there are a couple of ways to make it better Iron Lad. The first being, Luke Cage, right? That would be a way to make it better Iron Lad. The second one being, okay, what if we try to evolve it? Like we get whatever we get and it's just like an important on reveal and we play that and we Cersei it. I think that, 6 months ago, that might have made more sense. I don't really think that's what the metagame is about right now. This card feels a little underpowered to me, actually. When you look at Iron Lad and its role in the current metagame, it's basically nil. It's only ever really used as a draw tool, a tool at getting further into your deck, whether that be in the Legion combo decks some of the time or in like Living Tribunal decks. This card does not have that utility of Iron Lad, right? And so you end up with a card that I don't know if it has a home, and I think at a 4/6 stat line might not really be able to force itself into many decks. I want this card to be a little bit stronger. I almost wonder if it could be cheaper. I almost wonder if this could be a 3/4 or a 3/5, and then we'd be a little bit more interested in it. I think that it's a solid card with a cool ability, but ultimately it's the kind of card that I can't envision a home for in much the same way that I can't envision a home for Misery. This is the card that if we were still playing like a Nihilist Cersei, I think would have a home. But I don't know that anyone's still playing that, and I don't know that it's strong enough to revive that. I'm really interested to find out. If you are someone who prides themselves in playing off-meta cards and finding value where others have not, Supergiant is a much better bet than something like Jean Grey, who we talked about in these terms earlier. Supergiant has had a loyal contingent of followers at the top end of Infinite, and first among them, I think chiefly among them, would be Stefan, who has been a consistent advocate for this card. But I do think that this is a card that has generally been not necessarily underrated. It's a very difficult card to play, but it's a card that has been like fairly successful in a small group of people, amongst a small group of people who are very invested in the game. I think Supergiant can have a real like rogue deck takes the meta by storm potential. The general way in which this deck tends to play is by either locking down priority on turn 4 with this card, and then playing with those numbers a little bit. There's a lot of intricate things that this deck does with priority and who reveals first and all of that stuff, but fundamentally it is still a mid-range points deck. Like, it is the kind of deck that has mostly been forced out right now. And that is the one knock that I would have on Supergiant. Like, it is a unique and effective rogue deck that has a similar backbone to many good decks, but ultimately, it is the kind of thing that is a little more gimmicky than it is fundamentally sound, and it relies a lot on your ability to leverage hidden information and win 50/50s. They're pissing me off making me evaluate this. Like, come on. Okay, you want me to evaluate how good the move package is going to be a month after Scream comes out? I have no idea. But luckily, by the time that you actually get to having to make this decision, you will have an idea. Ghost Spider is an incredibly important card in the move package. Will the move package be good when this catch comes around? That's up to you. Like, I can't tell you what it's going to be in a world where Scream exists. I have no idea. But right now, what I can tell you is she's a very good card if you're going to be playing Aranya and Madam Web and all that stuff. Definitely worth picking up. A great card in Phoenix Force decks. A good card in anything that uses the keyword move. If you plan on using the keyword move, she's a good card to pick up. Now, she does come as part of a package. She's not going to make that happen on her own, but she's a very important part of that package. If you want to complete that package, it probably is worth picking her up if that package remains good. Obviously, that's going to be up to you to determine. All right, y'all. Thank you for making it through that video. Let me know what you think. What spotlight caches are you going to target this month? And I, of course, have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. And I'll see you in the next one.